Franz Kafka was a Czech author who lived from July 3, 1883 to June 3, 1924. Over the course of his life, he wrote many influential novels and short stories, including The Metamorphosis, The Castle, The Trial, A Hunger Artist, and many more. When his works were first published, they didn't gain too much of a following. It wasn't until two decades after Kafka had died that his work gained some notoriety among many German writers and many Eastern European country readers that were living under communist governments at the time. Throughout the 20th century, many of his readers and critics have given Kafka's works, and works by similar authors, a colloquial term known as Kafkaesque, to describe the surreal, absurd style that Kafka mastered in his writings. In 1991, director Steven Soderbergh, the man behind Sex, Lies, and Videotapes in 1989, directed a Kafka-based film starring Jeremy Irons as Franz Kafka, and that film is definitely worth the phrase Kafkaesque. The film starts off on the streets of an early 20th century Prague with the aesthetic choice of the directors being black and white, most likely to fit the antique style of film at the time. A man is murdered in the first scene by a manic, hideous creature that emerges from the shadows. The next scene we see Kafka working as an insurance worker like he did in his real life. His writings are mentioned in the film by some people in the society, including a group of people that make fun of him for the premises of the Metamorphosis. Kafka comes out of a pub area and people ask what he's been working on. They're familiar that he's an artist, even though he works in an insurance company. And he says just a story about a guy who wakes up as a bug, and they find it incredibly amusing. He gets caught up in the murder of this man by the beginning by a female co-worker who insists he didn't commit suicide like the coroner had suggested. Kafka searches for answers throughout the town, and other weird occurrences happen, like a bomb being set off posing as a main course meal to a group of wealthy men, and more murders by the hideous creature from the beginning of the film. The hideous creature even tries to attack Kafka, but Kafka escapes. Kafka then finds that his female co-worker Gabby has disappeared, and that the source of his answers lie in a giant castle building in the middle of Prague. Once he enters the castle, the black and white that was the general look of the film has changed to a more technicolor look, changing the overall atmosphere of the setting. The inside of the building looks a lot less like early 20th century Prague, and more like it's from Terry Gilliam's Brazil. Kafka finds that Gabby's here in this building with tests being run on her, with many other people. And the explanation of the recent events going on in Prague, that it's a conspiracy run by people in the underground, that they are in charge of manipulating the people and the events happening in the city. The conspirators try to catch Kafka after he learns what they're doing, but he escapes the building and the outside world is black and white again. He then goes to the coroner's office and finds a dead Gabby on the table. Even though he knows of how she died and who did it, he tells the coroner that it was a suicide, as not to shake up the city with the truth he just learned. The reception of the film at its initial release was quite shaky, mixed if you will. It was a commercial flop, then becoming a cult film among select audiences. Critically, many critics found that the film was directionless and uninspired. They also didn't understand what this film had to do with Kafka, even though the writer himself was the film's protagonist. Kafka was a worker in the insurance agency, just like in the film, but the plot and premise aren't based off of any particular Kafka story or an event in Kafka's life. What I gathered from the film and reading about Kafka and his works is that the film didn't try to be an adaptation of any particular Kafka work, but rather a tribute film to the atmosphere, themes, and surrealism of Kafka's work with Soderbergh's own image and ideas. It's perfectly understandable why the film is vague and confusing as it is, because Kafka's signature style is vague and confusing. A common theme of many of Kafka's stories, making them Kafkaesque, is that they are strongly rooted in reality, but a warped perception of it. Kafka's warped perception of it. For example, in The Metamorphosis, it's a story where a man turns into a bug overnight. Usually in any other story, I think, there would be a scientific explanation for it, but it never explains it. It's very rooted in the reality of it, and it's our reality. This bizarre concept is what makes Kafka's stories Kafkaesque. Nothing else is out of the ordinary, making the reader question the reality of the story and the world around them in the process. The world in the film is reality, with a twist that makes Kafka, the character, question his surroundings that leads to something surreal like in his stories. Kafka's works also deal with vague endings to his stories. The Metamorphosis ends on an anticlimactic note when the main character dies. Then his family focus more on planning his sister to be wed instead of focusing on their recently deceased son. The film's conclusion seems to follow the same theme of an open-ended vague endings, as Kafka seems to say, I didn't see anything and life goes on living, instead of taking action against the society that he uncovered. Nothing is accomplished in the plot, but there is a method to this. Many say that it is Kafka's way of expressionism, meaning that the story isn't plot-oriented in a linear fashion, but rather with the material at hand, expresses a worldwide view through the eyes of the writer to evoke a mood and a message. The message and the mood of the movie itself is unclear, but it shows that Soderbergh understood the way Kafka's writings worked and how effective they are, creating his own existentialism with Kafka as more of an example. It's for that reason that I believe this is a good biopic of Kafka. It's not a traditional biopic by any means, and I use the word biopic very loosely to describe this film. But it's the way that the film understands Kafka's works that hold it as a substantial film preserving his legacy.